Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We have for you guys Dr. Enette Larson-Meyer. She is returning for our second episode, and we're super grateful to have you here for a second time, Dr. Enette. And I know you said I could call you Annette, right? Last time, is that okay? Okay. So, but I
Absolutely.
just want to make sure we note that because you worked hard for that doctor.
Mhm.
So, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me again. It's great to be back.
Yeah,
Good.
and if our listeners missed the first episode, I think it was episode 118, and we did cover another study that Annette was involved in on athlete assessment and nutrition assessment of an athlete. So we will link that in the show notes if you guys want to go back and check that one out. But today will be all about thyroid. So, but before we do it, Annette's got some new two truths and a lie for us. So I will let you share those, Annette.
All right. So these are things that happen in December and January.
Okay.
At least two of them are. The truths are. Okay, so number one, the FDA introduced new guidelines for lead levels in processed baby food, setting
Oh,
limits of 10 parts per billion for most products and 20 parts per billion for root vegetables and dried cereals.
okay.
Number two, on January 6th, the Food Foundation released a report on plant-based meat alternatives and found that about a third of the products, or 33%, I guess, available in the UK had dangerously high levels of fortified B12, which were 2 to 3 times higher than that listed on the food product label.
Oh, interesting.
The next one is a study published on December 23rd
Hmm.
found that all but a few of 182 individual fish that were caught on the Oregon coast had suspicious particles in their sampled edible tissue. That includes things like microscopic pieces of plastic, fibers of dyed cotton, and cellulose from paper.
Okay. I feel like that's true because I think I've heard stuff along those lines. Amanda's shaking her head too.
I thought
I
I
feel-
read something about that too. Maybe there's like a
yeah.
little bit, but I thought I did.
Okay. I feel like the last one's true. Um, the first two are very interesting. I have heard certainly conversations around the heavy metals in foods. And so with the first one, you said FDA's new guidelines, lead levels in processed baby foods, and then what was the other? Did you say root vegetables and
Yeah, well, they set some limits
okay.
for people to be concerned about. So you
And did you say
apparently
parts per billion or parts per million?
parts per billion. And
Okay.
there is a chance I accidentally said million though.
Okay.
But
No, I
it's
think you
parts
said
per
billion, but I think what I'm thinking is I feel like a lot of times when I've seen heavy metals listed, I thought they were in parts per million. So then it's making me wonder if that's the lie, if there's a little like tongue twist there. What do you think, Amanda? I'm torn between the first two.
Yeah, me too. I feel like the fish thing is true. Um, I'm not sure.
But I could also
But
definitely see people messing up the B12 levels in like fortified plant-based stuff. I feel like
yeah,
I think maybe the first one is the lie. Is what I'll guess. Are you gonna go with it, Amanda?
I'm gonna guess. I'm gonna go the plant base.
Okay, we're gonna spread it out. All right. I think the first one's a lie with the FDA guidelines on lead levels, and then Amanda's gonna go with the plant-based meat. And we will reveal that at the end of the episode for the listeners, so hang in there.
Wait.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so today we're going to dive into Annette's article that was published back in 2020 called Thyroid Function and Nutrient Status in the Athlete. And we are very excited to learn from you on all things thyroid health. So we'll link the article in the show notes for the listeners too if you guys want to read it yourselves, but we're going to be summarizing that today. But why don't we start by first explaining what is the thyroid? Where is it in the body? How is it produced?
Sure. Yeah, I think the thyroid is it's a very small little gland. Sometimes it's referred to as a butterfly shaped gland because it sits on both sides of the neck.
Mm,
And then there's this little band of tissue that connects the two thyroids. It produces both thyroid hormone, which we think of all the time, but also there's specific cells that produce calcitonin. That's really important for bone regulation, although we don't talk very much about that aspect
Right.
of the thyroid.
Yeah. And thyroid is produced solely from the thyroid gland, or is it produced ever by anything else in the body?
It is, the hormone itself is produced only by the thyroid gland. So that's why it's so important if, if it gets damaged for some reason, being hit or radiation or having an autoimmune type of disorder, or as we'll talk about later, not having enough nutrients to synthesize thyroid hormone. But the interesting thing about thyroid that is really different than some of the other hormones, like I'm sure you've had guest speakers on here talking about energy balance and loss of menstrual function in women, because the hypothalamus is involved in the pituitary. And then in this case, it would be the thyroid instead of the ovaries or the sex gland. But the thyroid's unique in the fact that it makes two different forms. It makes mostly T4, which is a less active form. It does have some activity, and it has 4 molecules of iodine. That's why it's called T4. And then T3, and that's the more active form. But peripheral tissue will convert T4 into its more active form, T3. And again, that's unique about the thyroid. But then also some of the T4 can be converted into reverse T3. It really depends on, so if you have a molecule like T4 that has 4 molecules of iodine, and then you remove one, you can sort of think this by playing around with blocks, that you can end up with one that is T3 and then reverse, it's removed in the reverse order. But then when it's removed in that order, it doesn't, interact properly with the receptor. So our T3 is not active, but again, that may have came up on previous episodes talking about men or women with low energy availability that aren't eating enough, and increased amounts of our T3 if they're high as a marker of maybe, so I want to say it used to be a marker of starvation, and in fact it could be, but also just under eating in in athletes and
Interesting
situations, eating disorders.
Yeah. So you'd see elevations in the reverse T3 if there was under eating or eating disorders. And that's because the T4 there's enough to go towards that reverse T3, or is that kind of how
For some reason, it's such an interesting story. So there's different enzymes that convert it. And so overall, we have a feeling that what the body is doing is that it's saying, I'm in starvation mode, so I'm going to downregulate thyroid, that then is going to downregulate basal metabolism. And so if you already have T4, you're going to convert more of it into its inactive reverse T3 form. But, exactly what stimulates that process, I think they're still probably investigating it. Like you see that in hospitalized patients as well, anybody who's stressed, that sort of thing. Just again, it's logically, when we look at it, we're like, oh yeah, we're downregulating your metabolism because you're not eating enough, and you need to, spend energy on certain things like brain function that are important on regulate other metabolism. But
wow. Yeah. Interesting. And so most, like when you go to a physician, you get a blood draw. Most cases they're not testing, and maybe they are now. I don't see it as, I definitely don't recall ever getting my reverse T3 or T4 ever tested, but certainly TSH was tested.
yeah.
Is that still the common method?
Yeah, so TSH is a nice screening lab value, the thyroid stimulating hormone. And if it's high, that means that you are not making enough thyroid. It's like the opposite. And the reason why that is it's just when the pituitary makes TSH, it's stimulating the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. Well, I'll not say T4 and T3, but if there's not enough thyroid hormone, then the pituitary thinks, well, maybe I'm not making enough, and it makes more. So it does kind of the opposite. So you have to think about that. But that's their general screening lab value, and it's inexpensive and pretty easy to do. So I think different physicians probably have different protocols. That TSH is probably your first test, and then if it's high or low, or high normal or low normal, then you might run further tests. It's easier that way. Probably if you probably a physician, again, we're dietitians and not physicians, if they might be suspicious, maybe they run a TSH along with a free T3 and a free T4 to get a more comprehensive picture. I see our T3 being run very much other than in the research setting.
Yeah.
But
And what would be some of the things someone would see that would make them, from a maybe a symptomology lens, want to look further at the T4 and T3 or the reverse T3?
yeah, again, we're sort of talking a little bit out of, my scope of practice, but certainly when you work in the area, a little bit about the medicine. So apologize if anything, if that's the case. But if you have somebody who was older, who really had some signs and symptoms, thyroid disorders occur more commonly in women than men, in fact, quite a bit more commonly. And then also there seems to be a familial trait to it. So other autoimmune disorders are often people that are diagnosed have a family member, a parent, somebody who also has hypo or hyperthyroid. And then probably that is, just a clue that maybe we should, run them all at once. But
yeah. Wow, that makes sense. So for our listeners, what role does thyroid play in the body, thyroid hormone?
yeah, so the first thing that we tend to think about it being related to is basal metabolism, for the most part. But it's also responsible for general metabolism, things like regulation of body temperature, which of course is tied to basal metabolism, heart rate, and even carbohydrate fat metabolism. And what thyroid specifically does is it's one of those hormones. It's a steroid hormone, and vitamin D does the same thing in some of the other hormones. Is there's specific receptors on our genes that will bind with that, bind to the thyroid hormone or the steroid hormone, and it can upregulate or downregulate the expression of different genes.
Interesting. And the basal metabolic rate, I'm sure you've heard, or people will say, well, I have a slow metabolism, or I have a slow thyroid. Is there, with the movement of the thyroid hormone production, is it something that is, does it make that big of a difference? Like, I know certainly some of the symptoms could be weight loss or weight gain, but from a basal metabolic value, is there tests, or do we know that the difference in basal metabolic rate, is it changing by 100 calories, or, do we know how much it could swing?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly the answer to your question. Like, a certain change in thyroid hormone might lead to a certain change in energy expenditure. I don't know that for sure. It's one of those interesting things. Normally, when I give a talk, I start out with a little Kathy cartoon where, she thinks she's gaining weight and thinks that she has a thyroid problem. And of course, she's eating like 5 things on her plate. And that's one of the problem is sometimes we think about thyroid hormone related to weight gain, and it's probably not all that common. And later, I'm sure we'll talk about some of the signs and symptoms, but sometimes it manifests very differently, like different individuals have different signs and symptoms. And sometimes it's just like general fatigue and things that you really sort of masking as something else. So it might be overlooked, particularly in athletes who are thinking about, oh, maybe she's just overtraining, or maybe she's not fit enough, or he's not fit enough yet. If you do a simple TSH, maybe it is a thyroid disorder. So probably rare and not really the one thing that's causing all of our issues, but definitely in certain people, following up on the thyroid, just because it's an important gland, can really explain some things.
Yeah.
So, and back to the point about TSH is pretty inexpensive to run. It's not something that would really be a big investment. That could at least give you a clue to say the thyroid's fine, or it looks like there's a problem.
Yeah. And do we know much about how the thyroid hormone ebbs and flows within a 24-hour cycle, or maybe in women throughout their menstrual cycle? We're going to talk about training stress and overtraining, but do we know much about that? Like, if you were to blood test multiple times in a day or back-to-back days, is it normal to see some swings?
Yeah, so great question, and one that I don't fully understand. I'd have to pull to see what those 24-hour values are, but the range for thyroid hormones, that what would be sort of considered that normal range, is pretty high. Some people think a value greater than 2.5. So I think the top range might be 5 point something, and the units I never remember. I'll have to look up they are, but there's some units of something. But they're within that normal range. Probably it's just due to some fluctuation and normal differences between individuals. But I guess I should finish saying my thought about some people think that a value greater than 2.5 is high normal. So
Oh.
2.5 to 5, and it's something maybe to watch.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the initial patients, or I guess it was athletes that I became interested in, was somebody who had pretty high normal TSH and was a little bit shocked, and in doing a further analysis of her diet, really hadn't been consuming any iodized salt whatsoever. And it's like,
Oh.
let's try that, added it back in, and it came down to what would be more the typical value. So there's some interesting things in there, a lot of them anecdotal and a lot of case studies, but I think the big thing right now is just making those, well, athletes themselves and then people who work with athletes just aware to keep thyroid hormone in the back of your head and think, well, let's rule it out and see if it's a issue or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, it doesn't explain everything. It's not
Right.
the cause of all ills in the world.
Yes. Yeah. Interesting. And I saw something interesting in your article, and I'll read the quote that I pulled there. It says, "Reserve provides prolonged protection of circulating hormone to maintain the euthyroid state for approximately 50 days," which I did not know. I thought that was very fascinating. So it sounds like our bodies can produce it to some degree and essentially store some of it if we were to not make, is that what I'm understanding from that?
It's mainly just probably, yeah, I guess not necessarily store, but probably the half-life of the thyroid and just the amount of time that it's metabolized
Yeah, that's very
before
interesting.
problem.
Wow, that is neat. And so, with thyroid function in athletes versus non-athletes, would we see different levels in a non-athlete, or are we still wanting the same range, or would we expect to see kind of, again, those ebbs and flows with the thyroid hormone through different maybe training blocks or phases of one's season?
Yeah, so I think also a great question. And when we wrote that paper, I was really surprised when I dove into the literature and found out, I don't know that we know yet. And that's one
Yeah.
of the things that my lab is really interested in, for sure. Like, is there are athletes for any reason, maybe more prone to thyroid related disorders, or are they more immune to them? And I think we really don't know right now. There's evidence really to suggest that they are, but you do bring up training. And there was a great study. It was done by Hackney. I think it was in fact, it's over 10 years old now. And what that group did was they had men exercise well, they had them rest. That was the control for 45 minutes, or they did a continuous running. And that was sort of at a moderate pace for 45 minutes, or they did 90-second intervals that were all out.
Okay.
And then after that, they measured thyroid hormone, the T4, T3, and RT3. And they measured it all out for 12 hours after exercise, sort of meeting it after exercise and all out.
Wow.
And both of the exercise conditions, T3 and T4, went up. And maybe that makes sense, about it, exercising, maybe that's an important adaptation. But then for the continuous exercise, the T4 remained elevated for longer, again, after the intervals. And they really thought that maybe intense interval training resulted in some suppression of that peripheral conversion of T4 to T3. And maybe that could be used as a marker sort of for overtraining. But since there has not been studies that are sort of in that area, so
Yeah.
again, hope to sort of, bring awareness. And I think it's an easy thing. I guess there's two possible things. There is a chance that people did, measured it, and then it's buried in those papers. But it would be really interesting to pull them out, and then also just to start measuring it to see, maybe is it important? Is it a marker to help us know when pushing athletes too much?
Right. Yeah, certainly. I mean, it makes me think too with the steady state, and then thinking about an endurance athlete that is I don't know, maybe doing 5 hours of consistent ride on a weekend or, an ultra runner or something along those lines. It'd be very interesting to see what their thyroid profile looks like after something like that. Or certainly, that is a population we know that runs into a lot of maybe low energy availability. And I think we can talk a little bit about that in correlation to thyroid health too, just because of the huge energy demand on the body and then the difficulty of just hitting those energy targets. And maybe that comes down to micronutrients too that maybe support thyroid health as well. But would love to dive a little bit into that arena as well with the overtraining side of things.
Mhm. I think we'll kind of start a little bit about the basics and thinking about what nutrition is important for the thyroid in general. And,
Yeah.
the first one is obviously iodine. If iodine is incorporated in the thyroid hormone and you don't have enough iodine, then you're not going to make enough thyroid hormone. That's sort of the easy one. But there's some surprising nutrients that are involved. And one, I mean, I thought I knew everything there was to know about iron. And you read, and probably you've read a lot yourself too, and you just rarely see it mentioned that iron is involved in the synthesis of thyroid hormone.
Yeah.
But there's an enzyme, it's called thyroid peroxidase. And so it's really important for getting that iodine molecule into the tyrosine structure. And tyrosine is and it's a non-essential amino acid, but it forms the structure of thyroid hormone. So
Wow.
it's not usually limiting itself, but the iodine can be. So, but if you don't have enough, if you have low iron status, you may not be able to synthesize thyroid hormone either. And when you think about, when we think about iron, to switch, talk about it for a little bit, we know that it's important component of hemoglobin and myoglobin. And so in order to carry oxygen that an athlete is breathing into the active tissue, we need the hemoglobin, but also we need thyroid hormone is really important for basal metabolism and heart rate and carbohydrate and exercise metabolism. So it's like also could be another aspect of why iron results in fatigue, not the synthesis of thyroid hormone. It's also not one that you would think about, oh, this athlete is iron deficient, let's also measure TSH.
Right.
So that's two very important ones. And then selenium, and I'll get back in a second and talk about selenium and iodine together, but selenium is really important for, we talked earlier about the converting T4 to its more active T3 in the periphery. And that enzyme that does that, it's a deiodinase and it contains selenium. So also if you don't have adequate selenium, then you can make T4, but you can't make, or you have limited ability to make the active form.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
three really important nutrients that are involved. Zinc is said to be involved as well. I haven't been able to find something that adequately says, like zinc is really important for zinc fingers, and it's also plays a role in a lot of enzymes. So it's in there as well. But the main three are, iron, iodine, and then selenium. And then we can talk about vitamin D in a little bit, and then energy as well. But I did mention, or I said I would talk about the iodine and the selenium.
Yeah.
So soils are if a plant is going to have enough of those plants, or even animals that then eat the grass or the grains. If anything is deficient in selenium, then you have deficiency in the diet. So if the soil in an area is deficient, you will have a deficiency of iron and selenium. So it's really hard to know. It's not like you can look up in a table and it'll say this is what it is. It might be that's in that sample, but not necessarily dependent that that product was grown in iron replete, iodine and selenium replete soil. So we don't really know how much we get of those, which makes it a little bit difficult, at least from general food products.
Right. Do we know with selenium, or actually too with the iodine, can we only get iodine from iodized salt, or is it ever present like naturally in smaller amounts in like pink Himalayan salt or sea salt or these other salt options?
So for the most part, it's not in any of those salts. I like to call those the sexy salts, and unless it specifically says on there that the company has gone out of their way, because I have now seen a couple of sea salts that do say with iodine in them, but for the most part, they don't have it. Sources in the diet before we iodized salt came from dairy products and also eggs, but those are used both in animal feed and then also for the dairy products, the sanitizing agent when you're for dairy, like for the teats of the cow, keeping clean. Iodine is a sanitizing agent, so you get a little bit of iodine in dairy products and eggs as well in areas where your soil could be deplete. But in general, if you had adequate iodine in the soil, like the closer you are to the coast, and then iodine coming from seaweed, you have a lot more iodine that's in those areas. But it depends now with our industrial agriculture. So again, you kind of never know.
Interesting. And you mentioned seaweed, and is it also present in some seafood?
Yes. Anything that comes from the ocean has a little bit of iodine. Just kind of a natural form. Yeah. Yes.
Do you know how many times we would have to eat seafood a week to get the necessary iodine?
I don't know that. Yeah, that's a great question. With the seaweed itself, some of the seaweeds, like it depends on the type of seaweed. Some of them have really, really high levels of iodine. And that's a concern for a different reason. If you have during pregnancy, somebody who's on a diet that, naturally or culturally has a lot of seaweed in it, or just eating, I don't know if you've ever had gone to a restaurant and had seaweed salad. It's actually pretty good, little salty.
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. You can probably eat that, once every 2 weeks and your iodine that way. But for the cultures that eat that on a daily basis, there's also a possibility that you have to watch.
Okay. And those kind of, I'm sure you've seen them in the stores, the kind of like dried seaweed snacks. They call them seaweed snacks, but they're do you know what I'm talking about? It's kind of like square rectangle shapes of seaweed paper, basically. That is a source still also to get your iodine?
Yes, yeah, they are. I've seen them, and I have a picture of I was in a Starbucks somewhere, and right when you're waiting in line, there was iodine or seaweed snacks. I'm like, let's make a great picture.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I'd snack on those. I wonder too, like I personally will crave the seaweed snacks every once in a while. I don't know if it's the salt or if my body's telling me like, hey, you need to get some more iodine in your system. I haven't checked out the iodized salt though. I have to get that on my grocery list one of these days. What about selenium, sources of selenium?
Selenium is kind of found in random foods, but the last time I was on, that was my trivia question. So if you honestly are unsure if you're getting enough selenium, I mean, you can check your multivitamin, it might be in there. And with both of those nutrients, you want them close to, iodine and selenium. If they're, close to the RDA or 50% of the RDA, you don't want high levels of either one of those. But a single Brazil nut will provide close to the RDA. So adding that, or having, if you're one of those people who likes to eat 5 Brazil nuts, have Brazil nuts once a week. But and I think the reason for that is that I think the Brazil nut doesn't grow unless there's adequate selenium in the soil.
Oh,
other plants will grow, and then the product will just be deficient or
that's really interesting. Wow, that's cool. Yeah, one selenium. I remember that from my undergrad. It was like one Brazil nut a day keeps your selenium deficiency at bay or something.
Yes, I remember that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that.
Stuck in my head. Awesome. Okay, so we talked about iodine, selenium, and then iron, sources of iron. If you want to break some of those down for our listeners too, would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're plant-based, legumes are a great source, nuts, seeds, and then of course, red meat, or any type of meat, chicken breast, chicken thigh, fish, all have iron more in the form of heme iron or high in heme iron. That's pretty well absorbed. So those are the general sources. Grains have it, and now we add it. It's in whole grains, but it's also fortified in our breads and cereals. So lots of carbohydrate foods that are grain-based have iron. And then a little bit of fruits and vegetables have it too. With fruit, what's usually listed is dried food sources
Mhm.
because it's more concentrated, you remove the water, but fruits and
Mhm.
vegetables as a class just have very, very small amounts, but it's in there. So it
Mhm.
adds up depending upon, what your needs are.
Nice. And we talked a little bit about vitamin D. Do we want to dive a little bit more down that rabbit hole, but also food sources for vitamin D?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So we'll talk a little bit about vitamin D's role, which is really interesting. And one of the things that vitamin D plays a role in is the inflammatory process. So both too much thyroid and then not enough thyroid, the hyper and hypothyroid. And I said those in reverse order out loud, but the number one reason why individuals get that is because of an autoimmune disorders that
Mm.
sort of attacks the specific thyroid tissue. And vitamin D, the literature is pretty promising that if you have adequate status and you're prone to that it may be protective of sort of preventing or dampening that autoimmune response. Getting
Interesting.
enough vitamin D, particularly if you are prone to thyroid disorders or other autoimmune disorders, and maintaining good status is good. With vitamin D, the best source is still natural source is synthesis through the skin. And it really, in the summer months, unless, people are really photosensitive or have a family history or personal history of skin cancer, close to solar noon, 10 to 30 minutes, depending upon your skin tone, twice a week.
Mhm.
And then, lathering up or getting out of the sun. So it's not a lot, but that again is our best source. But in foods, fat, we've mentioned fish, so fatty fish, great source of natural vitamin D. Egg yolks, particularly interestingly, products from animals that are raised more sustainably, where the animal has been out in the sun.
Mm.
And at times like I mentioned for
Yeah.
us, not at 5 in the afternoon, but close to solar
Right.
noon, the animal will have more vitamin D in their product. It's added to milk,
Mm.
and the vitamin D in milk is really interesting because the high heat, the pasteurization and homogenation I think actually the pasteurization will kill the vitamin D, destroy it. So it's in there naturally if the cow has been out in the sun, but they just,
Okay.
years, I don't even know the history of when they started doing that, but the vitamin D is fortified in our milk, in some of our dairy products like yogurt. It seems like I'm forgetting a source of vitamin D. Well, I guess there's small amounts of vitamin D that are added to, you see a lot of sports foods that
Mm.
now have vitamin D.
Yeah. And is
Fortified.
cereals too, or some?
Yes, cereals. Yeah, great. Fortified cereal, ready to eat cereals are another common source. And then I guess some orange juices,
Yeah,
some other
Sunny D.
juices.
That's what comes to mind. Yeah. That is super helpful. And with vitamin D levels, getting those checked, we can be done via lab work. Do you have a suggestion in terms of time of year? Because I imagine if we were to test vitamin D multiple times throughout the year, it should show some natural ebb and flow with the natural sunlight exposure, right?
Yeah, if you're out in the sun, I mean, I think there's a couple things if you're really unsure. In the summer months, if you're not out,
Yeah.
getting tested if that's of interest. I think probably being tested in the winter may
Mm,
be, helpful. So if you ideally were curious,
yeah.
testing probably 2 or 3 times a year would be good.
Yeah.
Some vitamin D researchers that really think that, that's not necessary. We just know that people are not getting enough vitamin D, and just to take a supplement, that's within what would be the recommended range.
Hmm.
A minimum, take the RDA, but 1,000 to 2,000 international units a day if you're not getting exposed. So whatever the school of thought is, the researcher in me, and then, wanting to adjust my diet accordingly and not just take a supplement, wants me, like, oh, needs to test your values and work with people and be like, give advice. But
Yeah.
we can't do that all. So the
Right.
public health effort just to make sure you take a minimum of the RDA on a regular basis.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So we can test for vitamin D, we can test for iron, and we can test for thyroid hormone. Is there lab work for selenium and iodine?
So with
There is.
selenium, you can measure it in the blood.
Mhm.
Whether it's a good marker or not is somewhat debatable, but it is
Yeah.
expensive.
Mm.
One of the more expensive markers, and I even wonder if that would be something that anybody would run unless you were paying for it yourself.
Yeah.
Um, iodine is a pain.
Yeah.
I know you know that we're agreeing on this. Our marker is a 24-hour urine sample.
Okay.
And so the people that do my study and even a team that I'm working with right now, all the guys had to carry around their urine jugs. And what I was told is that was team bonding, but all the participants in my study, 24-hour urine, that's
Wow.
what we do. And then on top of that, the sample is pretty expensive to run. Just that, once you get it in your jug, it's shooken up and you measure volume and you measure concentration, and that's a little pricey. And then with that said, they also say it's probably better not to just rely on one iodine sample, but maybe do a couple. So
Hmm.
right now it's not ideal for really testing whether you're, have adequate iodine.
Hmm.
But if a dietitian or someone who's working and getting a feel for
Yeah.
what the athlete is consuming,
Hmm.
and certainly do pretty good with just a good assessment.
Yeah. So it sounds like, because it seems like a tricky one, some of these markers, in the sense that we don't know, we could do a nutrient analysis, but like you're saying, we could be logging these foods, but we don't know from a soil lens how much is actually truly in there. But of course, like assuming thyroid and all that is in a normal place, we would hope to imagine that we're hitting all our levels, and that's why things are in a normal place. But yeah, it would be interesting if there was a way to be able to pinpoint which area was the, if we were missing the mark on those two, since we can look at the vitamin D and the iron, like you're saying, and a couple of those other
Mhm.
things. So it'd be interesting. I guess you could rule some of it out. But yeah, the 24-hour urine, that, so they have to consistently collect for the whole 24 hours. They're not putting it in different jugs, like you're saying.
Yeah, no, they carry a big jug. I used to have one in my office. I think, I mean, not a dirty one, but a clean one. Just a big jug. And then, a lot of athletes consume water. So there's some people that we give 2 jugs, and
Yeah.
had situation where it's like, I filled up my jug, I need a
Yeah.
third one. It's like, all right,
Yeah.
that's the time where you don't want people to consume a lot of water. But yeah, they can
Yeah.
found, and really I think ideally you want them in the refrigerator, so joke
Oh,
about
yeah.
brown paper bag, but it's a pain, but
Yeah. Wow, that is an interesting one. So we talked about ways that we can test for thyroid via lab work. In terms of athletes and training and that kind of overtraining conversation, when would there be a situation where an athlete, maybe an athlete is doing their training and maybe they're into their season? What would be something that they would want to keep an eye out for if they potentially were showing signs of that low thyroid, and when should they get tested?
Mhm. Yeah, that I think that this is kind of an emerging conversation, and that probably some of it is going to be a little bit, coming from my opinion. I think we need a little bit more research, and we need people to really look at things like that right now and do more testing so we can have some good data to say, this might be a good time or not a good time. But I think if an athlete isn't feeling well, or maybe recognizing that I'm training pretty hard, but I'm still fatigued, I'm
Mm,
feeling fatigued, or I'm not really realizing the benefit of my training. And we can think of a handful, probably most of us go to, oh, are you getting enough iron? But maybe it's insufficient carbohydrate, or maybe it is something going on with the thyroid that's either natural or a lack of iodine. Natural meaning like an autoimmune type of disorder.
mhm.
And so I think that in the assessment process, the athlete both knowing that this is a possibility, hey, would you mind measuring a TSH?
Mhm.
Um, just to make sure that that is in the normal zone. And then if it's not, you catch it. And that can be a reason for an athlete, just based on a athlete that I worked with. It was an athlete who was a team athlete who was training pretty hard. And everybody, the trainers, the sports scientist, and the athletic trainer knew this person was training hard. Pretty good player, but the coach was a little disappointed in, let's say, the stamina of this player. And it actually said, why don't we train this player harder? He's not in shape. And
Oh
they're
no.
like, oh no, no, he's in shape. And then in the process of just initiating the TSH, discovered that he had um, an elevated TSH, and it was had a family history of that. And it was treated by the team physician. And interestingly, suddenly, the athlete has more stamina. And interesting, the other thing that he was doing was consuming a lot of energy drinks, caffeine related things
Oh,
that were, your Red Bulls and all of those, just trying to, because he knew something was wrong,
yeah.
but they didn't know what it was. And so in that one situation, that's not every athlete on a team, it's probably not going to be that common, but you catch it and improve it in that one athlete, and it makes a world of difference. It could,
Yeah.
a good player, it could even make a world of difference on whether the team wins or not, but certainly for that athlete's career. And I find that really exciting. And sort of to say one more time, when you're working with this, sometimes, or the media, and this is what happened with vitamin D. It's like, oh, vitamin D doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. It's worthless. We shouldn't test it. It's like, well, we made it into the miracle drug or the miracle vitamin, and it doesn't cause everything. But
Right.
situations where somebody's deficient, it makes a difference. And that's
Yeah.
what I think about what's going on with these nutrients.
Yeah. And so with his family history, it makes me think too in the situation of an athlete training really hard that potentially is in a state of low energy availability. And one of the symptoms of low energy availability could be suppressed thyroid functioning, correct? And
Yep.
is that something where once would a physician potentially start treating with exogenous thyroid hormone in those situations to fix that typically? Or can we get that thyroid hormone back up naturally, assuming it's not an autoimmune condition and we can get fueling back in a good place?
Yeah, I almost went down that path a couple of times, but it's easy to get on a tangent because the final nutrition piece, that is really adequate energy, that's important.
Yeah.
And so in general, what we're talking about with inadequate intake is something that's often called euthyroid sick syndrome.
Mm.
And with that, if you think about what it's called, so euthyroid, meaning that there's not necessarily anything wrong with the thyroid, at least initially, but you get decreased conversion of T4 into T3 in the periphery. And so that's kind of involved in the downregulation of metabolism. So now if we're talking about a physician who is looking at an athlete who you suspect of not eating enough, you can measure that and use that as part of your assessment to say, hey, look, you're eating well again. It looks like your thyroid's back up, or you need to eat this, and let's monitor what happens to your thyroid hormones. So I think that's a very exciting, say, somewhat emerging area. And I have seen that mentioned sort of the new IOC position statement, addressing the relative energy deficiency syndrome.
Yeah.
Can definitely be used in that level. But again, it's less about the thyroid production, at least again initially, and more about the conversion and of activation than it is about the thyroid itself. Although the more I read, so that syndrome was in hospitalized patients might be a time that you would see it, somebody who just had a heart attack. And again, you might think, yeah, that's the down regulation. The body needs to repair itself. It doesn't need to have hypermetabolism right now or high metabolism.
Right.
But I do get the idea, and what I've read, and again, now getting a little bit out of my scope of practice, is that maybe eventually the thyroid will, you'll get down regulation of the hormone itself, conversion. But
Yeah, it is very interesting that, yeah, the thyroid hormone and how the body responds. And it makes you think of, because if we're taking a thyroid medication, I imagine your thyroid itself, the gland in your neck would likely down regulate maybe production because it's already coming in exogenously, right? So yeah, it is an interesting area. If, like you're saying, the euthyroid situation where it's not Yeah, not like can the thyroid also be thyroid affected by, is it a tumor on the pituitary, or is that more?
You can, yes, you can definitely have more of the, so secondary or something going on with the hypothalamus as
Mhm.
well.
Okay.
So, but the primary hypothyroidism is, or hyper, either one
Mhm.
of those is usually, produced by the gland itself is
Right.
common, I guess. Yeah,
Okay.
I find that really interesting too, when you have athletes that may have had some sort of an injury from a, dangerous type of sport, a
Hmm.
bobsled accident. I don't even know why that came into my head, but those ones where, and that would probably be hopefully caught by the labs and is
Hmm.
less nutrition oriented, but those are
Hmm.
possible, definitely.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So, I want to be mindful of your time. So I'll wrap up with our last question, which is, are there any areas where you'd like to see further research done? Which I think we talked about a few areas we do want to see research done throughout, but specific to the athlete and thyroid health.
Oh yeah, so I think that this area is completely, ripe. I really would like to start to have people that work with athletes and do those screening labs just
Mhm.
add a TSH.
Yeah.
Because it would be really interesting just to get a general feel for, if you did 1,000 college athletes combined with different, say, colleges, or endurance athletes, if you did it at every Ironman or every
Yeah.
major 10K or a 5K event, and everybody who had a screening test, you'd have a feel for how many people are running around out there that do have,
Hmm.
hypo or hyperthyroidism.
Yeah.
One of the things you made me think, and I just want to bring the reader's attention to this because I think this was such a fascinating article. I'm looking it up really quickly. I think I had it open. It was a study it was in hyperthyroidism that was done in Graves' disease in
Okay.
a college golfer. And how
Oh.
they even noticed it was, she was having probably some heart flutters and,
Hmm.
palpitations and probably a little nervous. And you think these happen to everybody, but
Hmm.
what they did was in that particular school. Oh, here I found it. It was Wang in Physician Sports Medicine in 96.
Okay.
That particular article has a handful of studies that were done in athletes. But from the freshman year to, she must have been a fifth year senior, you
Hmm.
could see the eyes sort of expand and grow
Oh,
to that
yeah.
big eyeball that you have
Hmm. Hmm.
Graves' disease. And it's just fascinating to look like in the middle zone. You're like, if now that you know what happened on year 5, you can look on year 3 and you could be like, something is happening.
Yeah.
And if that had been caught, I think the article said in this particular case that it was caught and she went on to have a successful, fifth year, but then
Good.
I'd get another reason if it had been caught
Hmm.
earlier, maybe she would have, had
Yeah.
anxiety and stress in her life and maybe
Yeah.
performed better early on. So
Mm.
testing for every type of thyroid disorders and then thinking about the nutrition component,
Hmm.
potential nutrition component is just important. So my big
Yeah.
thing is, we need to study it and learn more. I feel like we're in that zone where it's
Yeah.
just awareness and knowing the possibilities of.
Yeah. It is very exciting. I mean, gosh, I remember, I feel like it hasn't been long where thyroid was even a thing that was talked about too much, and let alone tested in lab work with your, primary care. To, and then I think I even remember a time when like T4 and T3 were like, it was like, we don't really know about those. Like, all right, do they make a difference? Do we need to, are they important? That kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it's neat to see just, all science, we just continue to evolve and learn more and more as we get deeper into it. So yeah, very, very exciting to learn more over the years too, as more stuff comes out, and learn from you, hopefully more in the future as well. Okay, so I'm going to circle back to our two truths and a lie. So we had the FDA's new guidelines around lead levels in processed baby food, and I believe you said root vegetables, and then the plant-based meat alternatives had a third of the products in the UK had dangerously high levels of B12. That was 2 to 3 times higher than their label, I believe you said. And then the fish article where all but a few fish caught on the Oregon coast had particles in it of, I think you said cellulose fiber and microplastics and things of that nature. I thought that one was true. I think Amanda and I both thought that one was true. And then we were torn between number 1 and 2. So which one was our lie?
Yeah, so 3 is definitely true. And yeah, number 1 is true. The FDA did just
It
recently
is.
come out with those guidelines, which is,
Okay.
like, good, but then always when you think about lead in baby food, it's just kind of scary.
Yeah.
And the one with the plant-based meats is the opposite. Actually, what they found was that a third of them didn't have iron or B12
Oh,
in them.
interesting.
So that
Okay.
they were sort of, when you're talking about athletes about plant-based diets, and it's like, oh, a lot of these plant-based meats are fortifying them and
Yeah.
are a source, but in this
Yeah.
particular case, they weren't.
Shoot. Yeah. Oh man. So talking about the baby foods and lead and just heavy metals in general, in food, correct me if I'm wrong, from my understanding, I mean, I know there was a lot of talk around plant-based protein powders for a while being higher in heavy metals. And or was that because plants are just more efficient at pulling those things out of the soil, or was this somehow getting added in after the fact?
That is a good question. And I remember hearing that in passing, but, don't know for sure. But I would bet, just knowing what happens with supplements and that inadvertent addition, that
Mm.
was probably something from from sloppy manufacturing.
Oh,
if
okay.
you would
Okay.
say. But I don't know that
Yeah.
for sure. It's a great question.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Awesome. Okay. Where can our listeners find you, follow you, all that good stuff?
Right. So I am on X, that we call it now.
Yeah.
RD. And then I also am at enette@vt.edu.
Right.
So this went really quickly, and I just love your questions. I think when I
Oh,
come on here and you ask questions, I'm like, oh, I should investigate that a little bit further. So it's
talking
been
to you gets my wheels spinning. Yeah, I was the kid that always asked why. Like, I want to know why. So yeah, it is very interesting. And then yeah, having the endurance athlete brain perspective too, always curious like the crossover with a lot of these things. So yeah, I think this has been a super informative episode, and this has been a learning experience, of course, always for me when I get to speak to you. So thank you again so much for joining us for a second time, Annette.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.